You know, it seems that today, more than ever in the history of vinyl, we're being bombarded with, inundated with, categorized with, parceled out to all sorts of buzzwords in the VC, the vinyl community, audiophiles at large. 45 RPM, flat profile, clarity vinyl, VM900 vinyl formula, one step, remastered from the original analog tapes, remastered from the remastered analog tapes, cut to lacquer, Super Sense, anyone? That's like the latest buzzword now. Certainly has been for the last couple of weeks. Half-speed mastering. There's another one that we haven't heard enough about. Original versus remastered record. Plangent processed remastered record. Original US pressing versus the fifth Canadian pressing. The Albanian pressing. No, it's the German press. That's the one that you really, really want. And I can't help but think that as all these terms have really taken over, we're more confused than ever as to what is a good sounding record. And do any of these acronyms and synonyms and isms even mean anything? What difference does it make whether a record was pressed at Analog Productions' UHQR system, or MoFi's One Step, or half-speed mastered that Abbey Road has been pushing for a number of years now, as have many others, of course, throughout the lifetime of records? Does any of that guarantee a good sounding record? Could it be that your bone stock record that you find in the not $1 bin anymore, call it the $10 bin, that's really the record that you actually want? I don't know. Let's find out. So unless you've been living under a rock, you have seen my last video, which has been the most popular by far in SonicFlare's channel lineup. The AI-infused Fleetwood Mac video, where basically a friend of mine, Aaron, and I set out to discover whether it's possible to leverage AI, the $1 million lab in your pocket, as I call it these days, because everybody's got access to it now, whatever your preferred agent is, whether it's Manus, Gemini, Grok, etc., etc. And will that AI be able to discern the differences of Fleetwood Mac Rumours, the reissue from 2009, Kevin Gray, Steve Hoffman, or my American pressing from 1978? And of course, it did. And not only did it, but completely correlated the findings of what Aaron and I both heard ourselves. And that is to say that for all intents and purposes, the reissue is in fact the better sounding copy of it. Now, what was of course also incredibly satisfying to watch and observe and see was the comments in the comments section of that video and the healthy discussion that ensued. And the two sort of dominant themes that came out about it were, well, how can AI discern any of that? It doesn't have ears. How could it possibly hear any of that? That was number one. And the second most prevalent conversation piece was, well, wait a second. AI just went out to all the forums and interwebs, downloaded whatever other people were saying, and spat that out as de facto fact between those two reissues, or the reissue and the original. So let's set the record straight as to what AI actually did and how it derived the information that we then presented in that video, which is going to be the foundation for all videos going forward that will leverage AI as a conversation piece and or foundational piece to the video itself. So what's the process then? It's actually quite simple. In my case, I am picking the best source that I can get my hands on. That is, of course, the best pressing of the record that I can get my hands on. And I'm putting that on the best playback machine that I have available, which is the Kuzma XL Air and SAT LM09 9-inch arm, coupled with the Lyra Atlas or DS Audio Grandmaster. Of course, depending on which one I use, they either go through the Mola Mola Lupe, exceptional phono amplifier for around $12,000 these days, and or of course, if I use the Grandmaster, it goes through the DS Audio optical cartridge encoder made by EMM Labs, the DSEQ1, which has really been my de facto reference vinyl setup for quite some time now, ever since optical cartridge came to be. What happens next is very simple. That signal, without going through the preamp, so I'm taking it line out straight from the phono energizer or the Mola Mola Lupe, goes into my trusted Tascam DA1000 analog to digital converter and recorder. I then record and digitize the track at 2496, so 24-bit resolution, 96 kilohertz sampling frequency, which is plenty to discern any of these differences. It's also the sweet spot of the DAC chips and the A to D chips that are inside that Tascam box. That information is stored on a CF Express compact flash card, and I dump that into my Mac. I load up Manus and let the drum rolls start. What happens next is actually quite simple. I've developed a protocol, a testing protocol if it were, to load very specific audio analyzing tools into Manus, or I should say Manus loads them automatically, that I then use to process these files and do a file-to-file direct side-by-side comparison. So the AI agent, in this case Manus, has nothing to do with going to the internet, on forums, on Reddit, whatever, sourcing information from those places. Instead, it uses those audio analytics tools that it has loaded, really mostly machine learning stuff, to convert the signal into a waveform and then start analyzing the tracks and the differences within them. So think of it kind of like your favorite health tracker has a heartbeat functionality at the most basic level. But then also think about that you can derive all sorts of ancillary information coming from just your heartbeat. AFib, the average time response and step response of your heart, and so on and so forth. So the AI agent, in very similar fashion, is able to derive all sorts of information from that waveform and comparing it directly to the other waveform on the other file. That's essentially it. In a nutshell, that is what I'm doing to create these AI feedback mechanisms that will then spit out and tell me, hey, this record sounds like this record sounds more like that, this record has a wider stereo image, this one has a narrower stereo image, the dynamic range on this record is higher than the dynamic range on that record, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. Hopefully, this clarifies any and all confusion as to what this process is that I'm using and how I derive and get to the information that I then share with you guys on these videos. So one of the things that I've been asked about quite a bit lately is, well, wait a second, there are multiple reissues of the same album out. Which one do I pick, Danny? And of course, the answer to that comes down to your own personal preference, obviously. Which one do you think sounds better? But in this case, I actually picked the Flying Burrito Brothers VinylPhyle reissue that just came out recently, and of course the trusted Intervention Records reissue that came out a couple of years ago that has since been repressed and still sounds amazing. Incidentally, both were cut from the exact same analog tape that is a copy, a flat copy of the master that was done in 1996. Next up, I have one of my favorites, which is Countdown to Ecstasy, Steely Dan. And this happens to be a run-of-the-mill $10 Canadian 1980 reissue versus, of course, the highly regarded Acoustic Sounds Steely Dan catalog reissue that came out a couple of years ago. Of course, I, like so many of you, bought that entire set, and I never really did a video on Steely Dan and the UHQR reissues that came from Analog Productions, but today we're going to look at it. And last but not least, at least for this video, we're looking at a classic British jazz prog album and band called Turning Point. And this is their album called Silent Promise. They only have 2 albums, and both of which are going to be reissued by a dear friend of mine, Craig Crane, Analog October Records. This would be their 4th and 5th title, succinctly. And he sent me the test pressings for several of his new releases coming up. And I've, of course, cleared releasing this information based on the test pressing with him. And he's fully behind this, as he calls it, the K-Tricks, analysis paralysis. And we'll see what comes of it. Incidentally, this is a UK original on the Gull label. And I can't wait to tell you guys all about it. So I pull up my trusted $1 million, probably more like $1 billion. I mean, look at the evaluations of all these AI companies going through the roof. ChatGPT is what, several $1 billion. They're supposed to have an IPO later this year, I think. They keep pushing it back, but at any event. So again, opening up Manus here, which is owned by Meta. I am looking at the forensic audio analysis of the Flying Burrito Brothers. Of course, the comparison is between the Intervention Records record, cut by Kevin Gray, versus the VinylPhyle reissue that was cut by Joe Nino Hernes. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, buddy. Let's just call you Joe. How about that? And, it's kind of funny. When I first put on the VinylPhyle, because I already was familiar with Shane's Intervention record reissue, I wasn't really sure what to expect. This was the very first VinylPhyle title that I have gotten. And put the needle on the record, as they say. And the first tone was that of silence. And it was kind of shocking, actually. Turns out that this VinylPhyle that was pressed at RTI is probably the single quietest record that I've seen come out of RTI in ages. Doesn't seem to indicate any kind of specific vinyl formula. It just is a damn quiet record. So that was literally the very first thing I noticed. The next thing I noticed was, where is all the oomph? Where's the music? Where's the sauce? Where's the magic? It sounds okay. It sounds very clinical, very sort of analytical because of that super quiet background. But I'm missing the jump factor. I'm missing the boogie. I'm missing the rock and roll. So I'm like, all right, maybe, hey, it's been a while that I've heard that record. Let me put on the Intervention record. Of course, the first thing I noticed there is it's much higher noise level, unfortunately. But, look, at the end of the day, the noise level really is between the grooves, obviously, between cuts. And when you first cue it up, it sort of dissipates into the ether when it comes to the music content actually playing. But still, it's noticeably louder in noise pollution, as I call it, than the VinylPhyle. But here's the big surprise. There it is. There's the boogie. There's the magic. There's the rock and roll. Heck yeah, man. My feet are tapping. I'm bouncing around. I'm starting to feel my heart rate go up a little bit. And, oh my God, yes, the Flying Burrito Brothers, man. There they are. They're jamming. And that was essentially repeated cut after cut, track after track throughout the two albums. And so for me, it was a very simple and easy answer. Which one do I prefer? Which one do I think is the better sounding one? The Intervention record by a mile, right? Even though, yes, the VinylPhyle is quieter, the Intervention record is the one that you really need to get if you want a boogie and woogie. So I was curious to see what Manus would come up with and discern as I loaded the files into Manus, into my forensic analysis, as Craig calls it, the K-Tricks, blue pill or red pill. So let's take a look and see what Manus discovered. A loudness level, again, keep in mind, they are using the exact same source material. It's that 1996 tape copy, flat transfer. The Intervention Records has a little bit of a louder volume to it by about a dB, which I think correlates with the jump factor that I heard. Also, the crest factor, so the dynamics, interestingly enough, show up higher on the VinylPhyle by about 1 dB than they do on the Intervention Records one. Noise floor, again, very simple. The AI picked it up very clearly that obviously the VinylPhyle is the far quieter record. Stereo correlation was just about the same, so that indicates the soundstage image width and density, etc. And they're more or less the same. I mean, I certainly didn't hear any discrepancies between the two of them. Really, what stands out the most for these two is that the crest factor on the VinylPhyle was a little higher in the higher frequencies as it was compared to the Intervention Records, even though the Intervention Records is the one that has a bigger bass boost that you can see in the graphs and is cut a little louder compared to the VinylPhyle. What does it all mean? I'm just presenting the information. Your own preference will dictate which one you prefer. I know which I prefer. Moreover, to me, the reissue, if you're already going to go through the trouble of a reissue, it should be better than the original. I mean, that's the premise of a reissue, right? You're supposed to be getting something of better quality than what was there originally. At least you would hope so. And so to me, to my ears, I've only heard an original once before, a long time ago, and it sounded like typical sort of 60s compressed, loud, shrill records. It didn't particularly move me one way or another. Great music, obviously. But the Intervention Records, again, based on what Shane told me, that this is what's on the tape, is clearly the one that is superior to both the original and the VinylPhyle, in my opinion. And there we have the first title down. So next up, let's take a look at the Steely Dan UHQR versus my run-of-the-mill Canadian 1980s press of Countdown to Ecstasy. I pull up my glasses once again, taking a look at my billion-dollar pocket in my lab, and let's see what we come up with. Boy, there's a lot of info here. So the first thing that I notice when I queue up my Canadian press is, you get punch, there's shove, you get the beat. I mean, look, let's face it, the Steely Dan stuff, yes, it's an audiophile favorite. Is it an exceptional high fidelity recording? Not by any stretch, right? It's your typical 70s recording. Sounds okay. It's not spectacular. I think Gaucho is probably the best sounding record that Steely Dan ever made. But be it as it may, you do get a sense of the musicality of it, right? It's great. You boogie woogie. It's you turn it up. The louder you play it, the better it sounds. You know what I'm talking about? That feeling that you get, the tickle in your pants, the flapping of your socks, if it were. And so I was like, okay, this is cool. Noise level is, it's okay. I mean, nothing particularly sensitive to write home to about. So then I'm like, all right, well, the UHQR clearly is going to decimate this Canadian pressing. At least for $150, you sure would hope so. And so I pulled out the Steely Dan UHQR, plucked it on, of course, mastered by Bernie Grundman the Great. And yeah. So yes, it's a little quieter. These flat profile UHQRs on Clarity Vinyl have never really been quiet. I think there's a handful of them that I have that you could actually legitimately say that about them. For the most part, they're noisy and far noisier than they really should be given the price point. And, the whole parlance of, the ultra high quality record. I mean, clearly noise and surface noise would certainly play a part in how high quality a record is. Sort of, kind of, yeah. Probably. I would think so. So the first thing I notice is, yes, it's a little quieter, but then the music kicks in. And in this particular case, the Your Gold Teeth is the track that I looked at. I was kind of missing the oomph. I was missing the boogie woogie. It just sounded okay. I mean, I was like, okay, well, hey, maybe my oral memory hasn't given me a chance. So I quickly swapped to my Canadian press, and sure enough, there it is. Yeah, it's a little noisier, but dude, it's the music's there, boogie woogie. Now, I will say that the UHQR did have a wider stereo image. I could clearly hear that, and you too will be able to hear exactly what I'm listening to, because these files are all contained in the download link below. So you can see for yourself what it is that I was listening to and evaluating and comparing against. And so, you look at things like the RMS level. They're about the same. The crest factor on the US original is definitely higher by about 1.5 dB, and you can hear that. The crest factor is the dynamic range. Then we talked about the noise floor. Manus correctly identified it, that the OG that I have from Canada is noisier than the UHQR. High frequency extension seems to be better on the UHQR. And and then of course the stereo imaging, again, what I mentioned earlier, the correlation is such that the UHQR definitely has the wider soundstage. You can look at the spectrograms, the plots, and then of course the conclusion and verdict. What does Manus tell me? Well, they're both high quality pressings, but they present different distinct sonic profiles. And so if you're looking at what I'm looking at from a sort of natural dynamic sound and sound quality, then that Canadian is certainly better than the $150 UHQR. Now, it may surprise you to learn that I've done all this with the other Steely Dan titles in the catalog, and the results are pretty much the same across the board, which leads me to believe that, or not believe so much as in make a statement that Steely Dan UHQR reissue was more of a dud than a star-studded thud. because it just doesn't sound all that much better than originals and or Canadian reissues for $10 that you can pick up any day of the week on Discogs or eBay. And I never mind hot stampers or anything like that, which I actually do have a couple of for other titles. But I'll be discussing more of the Steely Dan catalog in upcoming videos. So yeah, Steely Dan, Ecstasy, Countdown to Ecstasy, definitively the Canadian reissue from 1980 spanks the UHQR. There's that. Don't know what else to tell you. Now, for the final title, let's take a look at Turning Point and Analog October Records, the reissue. So here's the Turning Point. My Gull original. You know, to be perfectly frank, I wasn't familiar with Turning Point up until Craig recommended it to me years and years ago, before he even thought about reissuing these two titles of their catalog. And I instantly just completely went nuts over Turning Point. It's exactly my kind of sound, that 70s fusion, jazz prog sound from Britain. Absolutely love it. Terrific. The only problem with it was that my Gull original is, it's very noisy. These are kind of hard to come by in clean condition. My jacket is certainly in much higher quality than the record is. That said, it gave me a good indication of, hey, other than the noise, here's what I can expect. And this is one of those times where really, truly, the reissue completely destroys the original in every aspect. And specifically, if I look at some of the Manus comments here, stereo image, so much wider than the original. Noise floor, obviously that much lower. Dynamic range, so much more present and available on the Analog October reissue than the original. You immediately hear it, right? There's just more punch. There's more, the music is just, and particularly for this kind of music, this sort of atmospheric jazz prog stuff, it lends itself to dynamic range very naturally, and you get it in spades on this Analog October forthcoming reissue. Now, here's what's interesting, is that the Analog October reissue is actually from a digital source. Let me backtrack. They received the original analog tapes, and the first cut that they made off of them had a persistent high bias frequency noise that you heard throughout the entire side A and side B. And so Craig and Casper, Gearbox Records, where this was reissued and remastered, made the distinct decision to essentially add a digital process and remove that high bias frequency noise in order for you to get a cleaner, better sounding record. So it is a digitally sourced reissue. You don't obviously hear that at all. And it is exactly what you would expect a reissue to be, right? It's got so much more information. It's so much more pleasant to listen to. And so, yeah, I'm super stoked for these two AOR reissues coming up from Turning Point. They should be shipping later this fall. And we are going to look at the other AOR reissues coming up and many, many more records as I'm using this AI profile and K-Trix analysis paralysis for all my reviews going forward. That said, I am posting all this information for these three albums in the comments box below. You can download it, see for yourself, hear for yourself. The sound samples are all included, and you can run it through your own AI agent if you want to, or play it back through your hi-fi if you want, or headphones, whatever is your preferred means of entertainment. And yeah, have fun, knock yourselves out. Please engage in the comments below. What's your take on all this? Does it mean anything to you that the Steely Dan was an UHQR reissue with all the bells and whistles, 45 RPM, clarity vinyl profile, Bernie Grundman mastering, pressed at quality record pressings, and then it gets completely spanked by a $10 Canadian 1980 reissue? I don't know. I really don't know.